Once again, audience, as they are discussing, make sure that you guys are getting your questions in because there will be a Q&A after the discussion. They'll love to tackle some of your questions. So, all right, that's it. You guys have the stage for about 40, 50 minutes.
All right, I'm not sure where we are taking this. Is there any specific area that you'd like to drill through, or questions that you want to ask? Or I'm happy to tackle some of the points that you've made in the in your opening statement to see where we go from there, if you will. You tell me what makes sense for you guys.
Well, what makes sense for me, and the thing that I was most taken aback by, both in your book and in your opening remarks, is that the Calvinist and Molinist alike can say God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. In other words, that the Calvinist and Molinist alike can both use the greater good defense. And my skepticism that the Calvinist can do that is simply based on my reading of John Calvin. I tried to read through the Institutes before tonight to make sure I'm not misrepresenting him. And just to give one quote from Calvin's Institutes in 3:23:2, Calvin says, "For God's will is, and rightly ought to be, the cause of all things that are. For if it has any cause," and I'll add there, such as God's nature, "something must precede it, to which it is, as it were, bound. This is unlawful to imagine. For God's will is so much the highest rule of righteousness that whatever he wills, by the very fact that he wills it, must be considered righteous. When therefore one asks why God has so done, we must reply, because he has willed it. But if you proceed further to ask why he so willed, you are seeking something greater and higher than God's will, which cannot be found. Let man's rashness then restrain itself and not seek what does not exist." It seems to me that it follows from that for Calvin, God can create anything that a Calvinist considers a possible world. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that the Calvinist would say that human libertarian free will is logically impossible. Then it seems obvious, and here I will simply appeal to intuition, it seems obvious that the best possible world, you'd have to kind of redefine salvation from the way I understand it. You'd have to drop from my definition that the person is libertarianly chose to love God, but you could just say salvation is gaining eternal fellowship with God. It seems obvious that the best possible world is one where God determines that no one ever sin, all receive God's grace, all receive salvation, no evil at all occurs. But it is obvious that this is not that world. God can create that world, and God doesn't. In that case, it seems the greater good defense, or the morally sufficient reason defense, doesn't work, as God doesn't need evil to bring about that world. So it seems to me that the greater good defense is only available to the non-Calvinist. And so I'm wondering, Guillaume, where do you think the error in my argument is?
Yeah, the error is in supposing that because you don't see those possible good reasons, therefore the response is not available, right? The response is exactly along those lines, to say there are morally sufficient reasons, there are greater goods that God is after, and just because we don't know those reasons doesn't mean they're not there. The intuition that you're trying to share is to say, I can't possibly think of anything that would be better for God than to save everybody or to avoid every single sin in the world. So what you're saying is you're sharing your ignorance of what good reasons there might be, which is the exact move that the atheist is doing with the problem of evil, saying there could not, I cannot imagine what God would be thinking in allowing all this evil in the world. Therefore, it's not justified, and therefore God is not there. So once again, I found myself in the same position as I am in responding to the atheist, simply saying, yes, I hear your inability to see those morally good reasons, but just because we don't see them or you don't see them doesn't mean that they're not there, and that God could be having morally sufficient reasons by those greater goods, even if I can't spell out in every single instance what those greater goods are. So I don't think that I don't think your problem is with the ability to use the greater goods defense. I think your concern is that maybe the absence, like those greater goods are harder to identify, and therefore it makes it more difficult to hold in the face of our inability to say what those reasons are. I think that might be the nature of your concern here.
Yeah. Going back to my statement, when I was trying to make an argument that God would not and perhaps could not determine another person to commit evil, I think it's more than just an intuition there. It's the idea that according to God's moral law, and by God's moral law, I don't mean the Torah, I don't mean the 613 mitzvot. I'm talking about the moral law that Paul describes in Romans 2:14-15. And it seems to me that that moral law, according to it, that the type of world that an all-good God would choose, if determinism is inescapable for God, if he's going to create anything, is to create a world of universal salvation, of no evil, and so forth. And I would say that God's moral law flows necessarily from and thus accurately represents God's nature. And so it seems to me that in order for you to avoid this, you have to adopt divine voluntarism. You have to say, no, God's moral law doesn't flow necessarily from, it doesn't accurately represent God's nature. It may be his preceptive will, but that doesn't really represent God's nature. And in that case, I don't know how you get around the Euthyphro dilemma. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I need to fight off the Euthyphro dilemma here. I'm not in the situation of trying to place the moral argument for God's existence. But in any case, the response for the what's the difference between what God commands us to do and what He's bound by His own nature to not do? There's a couple of things to say here. The first is, I don't know that He's telling us that it's wrong for us to determine someone else to do evil. Like, determining is a very philosophical term. I don't know that it's found anywhere. And if you try to phrase it in ways that are a bit falling short of determinism, right, to make someone else do something or to bring about that somebody else does that, then you're back to denying what you say God does, even on Molinism, right? Because as long as you fall short of talking about determinism, your Molinist view will commit you to saying that God does all of those things about evil, right? He does bring about evil. He does foreordain that evil happen. He makes people do evil. Now, he makes them freely do evil, right? On libertarian view, but he makes all of that. So all of that language of God's providentially bringing about evil is true on Molinism and will find itself refuted as long as you don't speak directly of determinism on the Calvinist view to criticize it. But if you do speak of determinism purely, then it's question begging, because you're saying it's wrong to determine evil. Okay, well, I disagree with that. So now where do we go from here? If you readjust by giving me something a bit milder than determinism, you refute Molinism in the process. Now, and the second point I wanted to make about this distinction about what God commands us to do and what He's seemingly bound by His nature not to do is that there's plenty of things that we know are exactly like that, where the distinction between the creator and the creatures is such that there are things that are wrong for us to do, but that God has perfectly the prerogative of doing so without being morally tainted, right? Taking somebody else's life is one notorious example. God is free to take my life this very moment if He pleases. He's the author and creator of my life, is the author and creator of the world and sustainer of it. If it pleases Him to simply seize my life right now by stopping my heartbeat, there's nothing wrong with that, right, in God's purposes. But if I were to go and stop your heartbeat, I think that would be morally wrong indeed. So there's plenty of things that are different in terms of obligations for us as human beings than they are for God. And I don't see that determining somebody else to do evil couldn't be one of those things where there's a distinction and asymmetry between what's okay for God to do and what's not okay for me to do.
But it seems still in that case that the moral law that God has given us, that it doesn't flow necessarily from God's nature. I guess that's what I'm concerned about. And in the book, you're able to show differences between, like, people on divine determinism and pets, puppets, coerced people, manipulated people, and mentally ill people. I'm not sure those are the relevant differences, but I'll leave that aside for now. However, one point I'll concede to you is that none of those are actual cases of determination. So I wondered, do I really know, or do I really, do we have this strong sense that it's wrong to determine someone else to commit evil? Is that part of the moral law that God has written on our hearts? And so I thought, how would you handle an actual case of determination? And of course, my mind goes to demon possession. Mark 5 tells the story of the Gerasene demoniac. And interestingly, it describes what the demon does as what the man does. So we could say, on your view, the man is really responsible for the evil that he carries out while he's being determined by this demon. And it describes the demon's actions as his own. So to quote it, this man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." So the first thing I wonder, just to make sure I'm comparing apples to apples, that I'm comparing determination to determination here, is, let me ask you, on your view, to use J.P. Moreland's language, is there the same what it is like, qualitative feel or qualitative texture to doing something under demon determination versus doing something under divine determination?
I don't know. I've never been demon possessed myself. Do you have any personal experience? I don't know, you tell me. I don't know what that feels like. What I can tell you is you're trying to press me with an argument by analogy, right? To say that if we're determined by the demon and we cannot be morally responsible, then why would that be different for God? Or phrased symmetrically, to say if it's possible to be morally responsible when God determines us to do something, then why is it not, like, why don't we blame the demon-possessed person for their demon possession? So there's a couple of different ways of doing so. First of all, we could have a tracking condition, right? So the person could be unable to resist the activity of the demon, but having freely brought this about, there could be a tracking, and so we could blame it on earlier choices. But leaving that fully aside, I think that my criteria for distinguishing cases of manipulation, at least in the chapter on manipulation in my book, the relevant difference that I bring between the cases of like mad scientists determinists manipulating us to do something is the God-givenness of the impulses that we act upon, right? So the inclination, the fact that we act on our God-given characters and desires. So that condition is still present to relevantly distinguish between the case of the demon-possessed person and the case of being determined by God and morally responsible. So I would say that, yeah, maybe the demon is determining the outcome of the choice, and we could coherently say that the person is not morally responsible, assuming that there's no blameworthiness for being demon-possessed in the first place. But if this is purely a taking over of their capacity, of their will, of their characters and desires, then there's a bypassing of God's character, God-given character and desire, which removes moral responsibility and is absent in the normal case of a free choice on Calvinism and compatibilism. So there's no incoherence in maintaining that one is morally responsible and that the other one is not. I see. I took another note on something that you said that seemed strange. Yes.
Yes.
You said the demon does what the man does. So once again, if you fall short of using determinism language, you're finding yourself saying things that are equally true on Molinism, right? So if we take issue with the fact that somebody else is doing that thing as well, right? As the Calvinist would say, well, God is the one who does, the bringing about of the outcome of those choices. then the Molinist God does the same thing, right? He places us in circumstances that he knows we would, in which he knows what we would do. And so it's very meaningful to say he makes it happen. He does it as well. Or like the Bible says that he does about evil, right? So he says, I am the Lord and there is no other. Beside me, there's no God. I form light and I create darkness. I make well-being and I create calamity, right? I kill and make alive. So he's using active language of things, saying, I do those things. And yet we both agree that he's not blameworthy for those things, but his involvement in evil is described in very active terms of doing it. And so the Calvinist says, yes, that doing involves a determination. The Molinist says, no, it's not deterministic. But in that, I think that, again, the Molinist and Calvinists shake hands over the fact that God does all those things. They just disagree about the means through which he's doing it, right?
I would say that the Molinists and Calvinists disagree over whether, in the modern sense of the word, as opposed to the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman sense of the word, that God does all of these things. As I explained, I think that you're left with this dilemma when you read both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, that it's very clear that God cannot do evil, or at least would not do evil. But then on the other hand, you have these examples that you brought up. And Scripture doesn't give us a way to reconcile that. And so it seems to me that part of loving God with all our minds, especially if we believe that God is the source of all truth, as Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria famously said, that all truth is God's truth. So all disciplines of knowledge emanate from God as the one divine source. And it seems to me that just like nobody would raise an eyebrow over using archaeology to explain an unsolved mystery in the Bible, this is done all the time, that no one should raise an eyebrow about using philosophy in order to say, well, look, in the biblical
Are you under the
sense,
impression that I have a concern with philosophy here? Have you confused me with James White? Or
no, I haven't confused you. I haven't confused you with James White at all. I'm saying this more for the purpose.
So why defend the meaningfulness of using philosophy? I mean, clearly I'm doing philosophy.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay.
I realize that there may be some Reformed listeners in the audience that aren't. So I say that for their benefit rather than to try to make any point against you. But it seems to me that the modern sense of do is what is meant by strong actualization, that we wouldn't call weak actualization doing today. So that it's really it's two different senses. Where the biblical authors say both of them are doing, I think we in the 21st century, speaking normal English, would say, well, it's only the strong actualization that's actually doing.
All right, let's talk about that a bit. So I disagree that there's this ancient Near Eastern sense of the word doing. I don't think that the word study is going to give us that. But I don't think that we need to resolve this issue. But maybe let's talk a little bit about the implication of like the activity of the Molinist God in evil, right? So maybe a good place to take this would be to discuss a little bit the argument by Greg Welty, the so-called bullet bill argument. Are you familiar with the bullet bill paper from?
Yeah, I heard him give that paper at ETS, yes, right. Or EPS, yeah.
So without redoing the whole paper, I think that the simple point can be phrased pretty succinctly, which is to say that when you consider, our moral intuition about what makes somebody guilty of a murder, right, by firing a gun, we look at the situation where he's firing a gun, even if the bullet is standard and we're just facing the normal laws of physics, that person is not maintaining the laws of physics in place, so that technically he's not guaranteeing, he's not strongly actualizing the killing of the person because he's not in control of those laws of nature, which could be altered and therefore prevent the bullet from killing the target. But then, without having to bend the laws of nature, you could envision the scenario where he fires a bullet that has indeterministic free will, right? So the bullet bill goes and then has the freedom to refrain from killing the target, but in fact does not refrain. We would still say that the person who fired the gun intuitively is morally responsible, especially if that person knew that the bullet would not refrain from killing the target. So we have somebody who's firing the gun with the intention of killing somebody, with a bullet that could deviate, so it's not deterministic, but the killer is knowing what the bullet would do in those circumstances, and he knows that he would kill the target. And I think that those intuitions in place, we would say, well, that person is morally guilty, right? And so similarly, the God of Molinism finds himself putting us in circumstances in which, yes, we are indeterminists, we are indeterministically doing what we do, but he knows what we would do. And it seems like by the same moral intuitions as the case of the bullet bill, we would be saying that the God of Molinism is morally blameworthy. Now, obviously, I don't say that the God of Molinism would be blameworthy for doing this. Why? Because I say that God has morally sufficient reasons and he's after the greater good. But simply the intuition of the action, right? The fact that there is determinism or indeterminism in the chain of action is not the relevant factor here. What we are saying, and this is where the Calvinist and the Molinist once again should be hanging, hugging each other like arms above shoulders, is to say we both affirm that God has a greater good that he's trying to achieve, and the fact that he's bringing about this instance of evil for good reasons is what excuses him, right? So it's what makes him not blameworthy, is that he has the right intentions and he's after a greater good. So the simple fact that he's determining or bringing about the person is not really where the debated moral difference should be, right? So what do you think of that case, and what do you make of the intuition that the killer is morally responsible, even if there is indeterministic in the chain, as long as he knows what the bullet would freely do?
I think that the difference between the killer and God is the mens rea, is the state of mind. The killer clearly intends for this person to die. It's kind of like a mob boss ordering a hit. The mob boss orders the hit, and it's kind of like you watch The Godfather, and there are always these buffers that it goes through, so the police can never link it back to the mob boss. But we all know in The Godfather that it's Michael Corleone who murders all these people at the end, all the 5 families. And so in that case, of course, we would say that Michael Corleone is guilty of murder. Why? Well, because that was his intent for doing it. But I would say that with God, the intent is not to kill the other person. And here I would appeal to the doctrine of double effect, which says that if the actions of a third party are not intended by the actualizer, even if foreseeable to the actualizer, and if the actualizer creates the circumstances for some good reason standing contrary to the third party's actions, then the actualizer is not morally responsible for the effect of the third party. So I think that's the salient difference between the guy who fires the gun, or Michael Corleone, and God.
Right. And so in that, the Calvinist and the Molinist will be standing step by step with each other. That is, that it's the intention, right? And there's a double effect. All of those elements that you've listed are what the Calvinist would be using here to say that God, when he determines that some evil happens, he's after the greater goods, and that evil is tied necessarily to that greater good. And so obviously that means that we need to maintain a number of things, right? For using evil as a justifying reason for good, to use a greater good as a justifying reason for bringing about evil, is that the evil must be connected to the good, right? So it must be dependent on it, and it must be of at least equal weight, right? So there's a dependency and a weight condition. But as long as they are there, and again, just because I don't know what those greater goods are doesn't mean they're not there. As long as those are there, then the evil is going to be justified, and is going to be justified along the same lines as the Molinist does when defending the goodness of the Molinist God when he weakly actualizes a state of affair that includes evil. So it seems like we've successfully shown with the bullet bill example that we are either, like the Molinist is either going to, again, self-refute because his model will accuse God of doing something wrong, or it will use resources in their own worldview, which I think are fully accessible to the Molinist to excuse God, but all of those are equally accessible for the Calvinists. So I don't think that determinism is the relevant factor in assessing the culpability of God in his sovereignty over evil here.
Do you think there that perhaps you might be kind of attacking the fact that it's an analogy rather than, the point of the analogy? I mean, clearly, yes, if you want to press the analogy for all its details, which was never intended to be so pressed, that, there's still, on my view, there would still be quantum indeterminacy because, the killer's not controlling the laws of nature and everything else. But it seems like the analogy, if you don't press it artificially, if you go for the point of the analogy rather than saying, well, there are differences. Of course, there are differences. It's an analogy.
That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't think you've understood my use of the bullet bill example here. It's simply to say that you have a case where an agent is weakly actualizing a state of affair that includes evil, right? And so we're saying that just because there's indeterminism in the chain of causation doesn't excuse the firing the shooter, right? And so what we're saying is, if now you replace these circumstances with God on the Molinist model weakly actualizing a state of affair that includes evil, then you should transfer the same moral intuitions that declare the shooter guilty onto the Molinist God and make him guilty if the knowledge of counterfactuals and placing it in the circumstances where evil happens are sufficient to declare that the person controlling that is evil. But you and I both agree that it's not sufficient to declare that person evil because that person could have morally sufficient reasons, namely a greater good that they're trying to achieve, and you use the double effect doctrine. And all of that we both agree works, but what I'm saying is that this is what the Molinist must use in order to rescue God's goodness. It's not the indeterministic nature of the chain. And so similarly, the Calvinist is going to use those same reasons, and the fact that he says there is determinism is not the relevant difference between the two models. That's the point of the illustration. So I'm not, hanging on some irrelevant details that somehow there's a gun, whereas there doesn't need to be a gun. So I think that this is what Greg Welty's argument successfully shows, is that the Molinist is going to have a very hard time arguing that the indeterminacy of free will is what rescues the non-culpability of God when he weakly actualizes a state of affair that contains evil.
Tell me what you would think about this if I said, well, if it's possible for God to create creatures with libertarian freedom, and I believe that the plain teaching of several passages of Scripture, like Deuteronomy 30 and 1 Corinthians 11, is that humans, in fact, do have libertarian freedom, as I've defined it. If that's what, if it's logically possible to do that, and God has revealed that God has in fact done that, then you can make sense of the doctrine of double effect when you've got that the actions of the third party are not intended by the actualizer. They're foreseeable to the actualizer, yes, because of God's mental knowledge, but they're not intended by the actualizer. Whereas I think that I don't see on your view how you can say the evil wasn't intended. I think you have to say, yes, it was intended. God deterministically brought it about, but it was intended for a greater good. Is that distinction making sense, or do you still think I'm off base here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's going to probably boil down into what we put behind the word intended. I think that we would say, yes, it was intended for a greater good, in the sense that it's not intended for its own sake. It's intended for the greater good that it brings about. And I think that that's a very similar thing that the Molinist is saying. So yes, he's going to say that free will is no, but no, not even in this case, because we would not be saying, like, this is not a case where the Molinist is saying if free will is the only reason why this evil happens, right? So we are taking a case where there is an actual greater good, and the greater good need not be just the obtaining of free will, right? So there, presumably you don't, I've met indeterminists, I've met incompatibilists who say that every single instance of suffering and evil in this world is explained by the fact that we have liberty and free will, and therefore God could not have avoided it. Right? I don't think you're that kind of incompatibilist, right? I think that
No,
there are at least...
no, I'm not. I think I agree.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I agree with you that God could have chosen to create a completely deterministic world, and that that God could have chosen a sort of, other kind of salvation where it's, just that people come into his presence, regardless of whether they libertarianly chose him, or, that they just make it into heaven, and that's ultimately what salvation is. I just think that God has the option of creating creatures with libertarian freedom, and I believe, based on scripture, that God has taken that option. I'd like, if you don't mind, to ask a sort of psychological question. That I read your Confessions of a French Atheist, and I have nothing but praise for it. I love the book Confessions of a French Atheist. So all you people in the audience, if you haven't purchased that book, please go out and do it. And here's the thing. You seem to have been a very unique case. I've never, it's intriguing to me. I've never met somebody like you. This is my 18th year of teaching. And during 18 years of teaching, I've met many atheists, both students and fellow scholars. And one thing that all of them, when I talk to them about this, they will all say, if the correct concept of God is one where God determines evil, then that's a deal breaker. That if that's the correct concept of God, of course I'm not going to become a theist. As a matter of fact, some of my atheist students are atheists because they were raised in Calvinist households, and this was the deal breaker. Other atheist students who don't really have much of a religious background, they just sort of assume atheism as the default position, have told me that, yeah, if that's the correct view of God, then they could never become an atheist. And I have to honestly say, if I were convinced that God determined people to do evil, if I thought that was the correct concept of God, I would become an atheist. So I'd love for you to explain how, as an atheist, when you came to the problem of evil, you said, unlike any other atheist that I've ever met, God determined the Holocaust, God determined ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, God determined the killing fields of Cambodia. It's all good. Could you please explain the psychology of this?
Yeah, I'm not a psychologist. There's just a few things that I can say in response to your question about the perception of the biblical God, or what I take to be the biblical God, right? The first thing is that I wouldn't put too much stock on the atheists' feelings about descriptions of the God of the Bible. The fact that he can feel very morally repugnant to the unbeliever should not move us too much. The introductory lines of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion don't exactly make me shake in my boots just because he thinks that God is a malevolent bully. Is not something that I'm going to be adapting my theology about, right? The fact that the Bible declares that God, does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it, that's going to make some atheists think, well, if God is like that, I don't want any of this. Now, you and me both affirm those biblical teachings. And once again, the Molinist and the Calvinist are not too far apart. And I think you could imagine the simple foreknowledge Arminian or the open theist asking you the question exactly along the terms that you've said to me, like, wow, a God who makes us do evil by putting us in the circumstances that he just knows we would do wrong in. If God is like that, then I'd rather be an atheist, right? So I don't know that the psychology here helps us a lot in determining which view is correct. And I'm not too moved by this. I think that God is sovereign over evil. I think you affirm those words. I think God has good reasons behind the evil that he brings about. I think you affirm this much as a Molinist as well. And I think that we let the chips fall where they may in terms of the unbelievers. Now, in terms of practical ministry, I will say this, and I think I've said this myself a number of times. If you cannot be convinced that God can be morally perfect while determining everything that happens, then I would rather you hold on before you affirm that and you maintain that God exists, and then we'll see if I can convince you of Calvinism later on down the line. But I would prefer you being a Christian rather than a Christian non-Calvinist rather than an atheist. So we put the doctrines in the proper order, and I've had plenty of ministerial conversations where people struggling about questions around free will. And part of my evangelistic appeal is to tell them, look, I'm pretty convinced that Calvinism is true, but you don't have to be a Calvinist to be a Christian. There's plenty of sensible, smart Christians who disagree with Calvinism. Kirk McGregor might even be one of them, God knows. But there's a value in ministry in saying, look, this is a difficult question. It's a philosophical question of very practical importance, so it's not one that has no importance, right? So that's why I like the topic, that's why I discuss it, that's why I debate it, but it's not one that the faith hangs or falls on. And so I will happily point a non-believer who's considering Christianity to the existence of non-Calvinist Christians that have a very sensible position as well. So that's my more practical side of things. But, I like what is true, and I think that Calvinism is true, so I would rather you believe what's true. That's just the bottom line.
One thing that
so
I'm also...
Maybe... Yeah, sorry. So
you can go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've kind of announced the color here that the problem of evil is by nature going to be more on the defensive from the Calvinist rather than the offensive. Maybe there's one line of positive argumentation that I can try to corner you on a little bit and see what kind of answers you do provide. So it's in the inevitability of evil. So this is where the question of evil might be a difficulty for the non-Calvinist, and it's in answering to what point sin is unavoidable for a fallen human being. On biblical terms, I think that we would be committed to saying that it's impossible to live a fully sinless life. And I've used this, as you've probably read in my book, as an argument that Martin Luther has used, that Jonathan Edwards has used as well, and given it a little bit of a philosophical, rigorous formulation. But it seems to me like if we are affirming that it's impossible for a human being to live a fully sinless life, then we are denying the principle of alternate possibility, which says that you cannot be morally responsible unless you have the ability to do otherwise. Because it seems to me we are blameworthy for our failure to live a sinless life, and yet it's impossible, given our fallen nature, to live a sinless life. So it would follow that we're either not like that we don't have the ability to live a sinless life, and that it would follow that moral responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise. But if that's the case, then incompatibilism is not true, because incompatibilism requires that we have the ability to do otherwise when we exercise our free will. So I'm curious whether which of those premises you would grant, namely, would you grant that it's categorically impossible for a sinner to live a sinless life? Would you grant that moral responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise? Or would you grant that the principle of alternate possibility being false entails that incompatibilism is false? And obviously, if incompatibilism is false, then Molinism is false, right? So where do you try to stop that line of argumentation?
Well, there are two ways I would try to stop it. The first way is simply to say that in the literature, the principle of alternative possibilities has been used in two ways. One is the way in which you've just defined it, where your understanding of the principle of alternate possibilities is about moral responsibility. And that's not where I go with it. I kind of shy away from those definitions of the principle of alternate possibilities. I tend to lean toward those that make the principle of alternate possibilities about the definition of freedom. So when I say the principle of alternate possibilities, I'm not talking about moral responsibility here. I'm saying, let's concede with your book that, the sinners are responsible. But I would say a person is free if and only if he sometimes could have thought or done otherwise, where the antecedent conditions, like his inner desires, his belief desire set, etc., are insufficient to determine or necessitate the agent's choice. So each choice is up to the agent himself, agent causation, and not a result of the change in the agent's inner desires. You keep the inner desires exactly the same. The agent qua agent could have done otherwise.
Right, but you do think this is a necessary condition for moral responsibility, right? That's what you call freedom, and that's fine. And you typically it's a necessary condition for moral responsibility, right?
I'm not taking a position on whether that's sufficient condition for moral responsibility.
No, necessary.
I'm just saying that when I understand freedom is how I understand the principle of alternate possibilities, and I realize that there are two different ways that that phrase is used in the literature. Yeah.
Right. So let's not get caught up by the wording of the principle of alternate possibilities on whether it's about freedom or not. What you've just described as a person being free, right? So when they have occasionally the ability to choose otherwise, all things being equal at the moment of choice, that's a necessary condition for moral responsibility on your view, is it not? Like you cannot blame the person unless they had that kind of ability, would you?
Well, I really am not interested in debating that point. I'm interested in, more of the line of, does God do anything wrong? I'm perfectly willing to blame the person here. I'm perfectly willing to say maybe it's both God and the person who do something wrong. I'm not trying to get the person off the hook.
Right,
so,
I am. I am trying to show you that your view gets them off the hook. That's the problem, right? So this is why I'm trying to see is whether or not your view of free will entails that we have the ability to live a sinless life, which would be Pelagianism, and therefore a reductio ad absurdum. So clearly, I see that you don't want to excuse the sinners, right? But I'm saying that your view would seem to call for a degree of freedom that the Bible says we cannot have, on the pain of Pelagianism.
I'm not saying that the principle of alternate possibilities, as I understand it, has anything to do with moral responsibility, or that my argument commits me to a particular view of human moral responsibility. I think on completely different grounds from the principle of alternate possibilities about moral decisions. So it's not that I feel like, well, if I'm a Molinist and I have this definition of freedom, then I've got to maintain such and such position on moral responsibility. I don't see that conditional statement is true. And I would also say in response, yes, go ahead.
This seems hardly controversial. So this might be something, I don't know if that's something that you've just bypassed, but the freedom is a necessary condition for moral responsibility, is it not? Right? Typically, there are two kinds of things that are necessary for us to be blameworthy or praiseworthy. One is that we would have epistemic conditions fulfilled, that we know some of the relevant facts, right? So that if I pour sugar in my wife's coffee, but unbeknownst to me, it's been replaced by poison, I'm killing my wife, but I'm not morally blameworthy for it because I didn't have knowledge of some of the relevant facts, right? So there's epistemic conditions. And then there's metaphysical freedom conditions, which is that we need to properly, freely choose the actions that we do if we are going to be blameworthy for them. And if we are lacking the freedom condition, right, if we suffer from something like coercion or manipulation or hypnosis, those kinds of conditions remove our moral responsibility because we do not satisfy the control conditions for moral responsibility. So epistemic and freedom conditions are both necessary for moral responsibility. So when you do define free will in a way that's perfectly acceptable to me as coming from a Molinist, to define free will as this categorical ability to sometimes do otherwise than we do while holding in place all causally relevant antecedent factors, freedom description, that seems to me is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. But if that's the kind of free will that you take, it does lead to having to say that the sinner has the ability to live a sinless life, or they could not be blameworthy for it. And that's the dilemma I'm trying to press. And
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
that be my last attempt at pressing
yeah,
it on
yeah.
you if you're not prepared to face with
Yeah,
it.
that makes sense to me. And what I'm suggesting is that first of all, it's not entirely clear to me that um, that either that the doctrine of original sin is true. I come out of an Anabaptist tradition, which very much like the Eastern Orthodox tradition doesn't necessarily subscribe to the doctrine of original sin. And I would think that it's possible for a person to live a sinless life. I think Jesus proved that. And if someone said, well, that's because Jesus had a different kind of nature than ours, I think that's refuted by Paul in Romans 8, where Paul says that he took on the likeness of our sinful flesh. And he repeats the word sinful in the Greek twice, just to hammer it home, that he had the same kind of nature that we did, and yet proved that one could live a sinless life. And I would say that makes us even more morally culpable. But as I said, I don't think that leads to Pelagianism. As I read Pelagius, for example, his commentary on the book of Romans, written in around the year 410, and I look at what Pelagius taught, it seems to me you could summarize Pelagius's, it's not really a syllogism, but what he was saying in two steps. He was saying, first, human beings have libertarian freedom. Therefore, we should use our libertarian freedom to be good enough to earn our own salvation. And what I'm saying is that one is true, but two is false. How on earth could we use our libertarian freedom to earn our salvation? You seem to think that living a sinless life would earn salvation. Where on earth does that idea come from? I'm wondering. I mean, salvation is such a good that I can't think of anything human beings could do, including living a sinless life, that would ever merit it. And so I would say that Augustine made the error of saying, all right, I'm not just going to deny premise two. I'm just not going to deny step two. I'm going to nip this thing in the bud and deny premise one, and to say you don't have libertarian freedom, and then introduce his concept of original sin. He coins the phrase, and that therefore you can't be good enough to earn your own salvation, rather than simply saying, look, I don't care whether you could live a sinless life or not. You still can't merit your own salvation. That's just categorically impossible. It's not the kind of thing you can merit.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to say here. So the first is that it seems that you would be inclined to concede that the ability to live a sinless life is something that follows from this view of free will, and that you endorse it as saying, well, Jesus could do it. So my argument is that a fallen sinner is unable to live a sinless life, right? That's not to say that Jesus could not live a sinless life, but the fallen sinner's inability to live a sinless life was the point of contention between Pelagius and Augustine. And Pelagius was teaching that it's possible. He was not even saying that it's easy, or he was not even teaching that there's lots of people who actually achieve a sinless life. He was saying it's possible, and Augustine was saying, no, it's not possible to live a sinless life. So if we do affirm that it's possible to live a sinless life and that we deny original sin for the sake of libertarian free will, I think that Pelagius is owed an apology. But then after that, if we say that it's possible to live a sinless life, but that it's still not going to merit salvation, what I want to ask is salvation from what? If there is no original sin and the person lives a sinless life, what do they need to be saved from? Right? They don't deserve the wrath of God. They've lived sinlessly. And if there is no original sin, in the sense of original guilt, to say that there's an imputation of guilt from Adam, which would be the only way in which they actually have a guilt if they've lived a sinless life themselves, that would be the imputation of guilt. Presumably, you would be denying both of those things. Then there's nothing they need to be saved from. So I don't think that they need to be meriting salvation if they live the sinless life. I think here the Pelagianism has run full amok.
Okay. I guess there are two ways I could respond here. One way would be to say that, and here I'll use the language of Paul Tillich, that it seems to me you can say that we are saved from the fact of just sort of the distance, you might say, between ourselves and God, that there's this huge distance between us and God. And it seems like unless God grants us something to overcome that distance, something that we cannot earn, then we do need to be saved from that, if that distance is not to continue to be there. Secondly, I could say, well, why not, suppose you're right in what you say. Suppose your reading of Pelagianism is right and my reading is wrong. Well, then why couldn't you suppose a doctrine of original sin, according to which it's not possible for a sinner to live or a fallen human being to live a sinless life? But I don't see how that refutes what I've laid out as libertarian freedom. I mean, how does that show that, like, the sinner sort of in his room, doesn't have the freedom to, like, stay there and watch some porn? Or he also could have the freedom to just do nothing, or he has the freedom to curse God, or he has the freedom to go out and rob a liquor store. I mean, how does that remove his freedom from being able to choose between a range of alternatives? I just don't see that it does.
Yeah, and here that would be because the alternatives, if they're all sinful, then they're not morally relevant, right? So the ability to do otherwise that's required by this principle of alternate possibility is one in which the person does morally significantly different than they do in the actual scenario. So that's something that you can appreciate if you were to extend that view to me, right? To say, okay, my view is deterministic, so I'm saying that there's only one thing that the sinner does, and it's alleged that it's removing the blameworthiness of the sin when there's only one thing that they could do. Well, imagine that now I tweaked my Calvinist view just a little bit, and I said, no, actually, there's a million ways that they could do the exact same sin, that they could do it just a little bit differently, right? So, I mean, you could imagine, like, if the sin is lying, I could say exactly the same lie, but saying it slightly faster, like a fraction of a second faster, or a little bit louder. You get the idea, right? So that would be technically an alternate possibility, but it's not a morally relevant alternate possibility. So you wouldn't say that all of a sudden my view has removed all the problems about determinism just because there's an alternate possibility in which there's a slightly different sin. What is needed in the alternate scenario is a morally better option. And so that's why if you just rescue the ability to do one sin or another, you haven't really rescued moral responsibility on this view. As to the reading of Pelagius, maybe I don't think that we need to chuck it off to our misinterpretation, like the different readings of Pelagius. I think the words are fairly clear, right? So I have a direct quote here. He says, and he's talking to Augustine, and he's saying, "Once more I repeat, I say that it is possible for a man to be without sin. And what do you say? That it is impossible for a man to be without sin. But I do not say that there is a man without sin, nor do you say that there is not a man without sin. We are disputing about what is possible and impossible, not about what is and what is not." So I think he's making it as explicit as it gets, that the dispute is to whether we could live a sinless life, not whether we in fact do, and whether there's lots of us that do it. I think the mere affirmation that it's possible for a fallen child of Adam to live a fully sinless life is fully Pelagian. And if we deny that this is a problem, then I think we owe him an apology.
Well, I would say that what I meant by we have a different reading of Pelagius is simply we have a different reading of what exactly the heresy of Pelagianism is. I don't think you would say that everything Pelagius taught is Pelagianism, is the heresy of Pelagianism. It's not like every word that came out of his mouth is thereby Pelagianism.
Sure,
and so is the point of Pelagianism, and this seems to be the key bone of contention, is the point of Pelagianism the idea that a person could live a sinless life, but God in his middle knowledge knows that no one ever will? Or is the point of Pelagianism that people can merit their own salvation, that people can earn their own salvation? And there, I think that various councils, for example, I read the decrees of the Council of Ephesus in 431 in preparation for tonight. And I don't see how that one could really settle one of those readings over the other purely based on that. I think that there's a lot of contextual factors, historical factors to be taken in play there.
That's fair enough. I think we can leave that line of reasoning where it stands, and I'll stand with Augustine, and you stand with Pelagius on this one, but maybe not the Pelagian heresy, but with Pelagius nonetheless.
Yes,
All right, that sounds
yes.
All right, guys, good stuff. Good